I want to thank Andrew Henderson from Nomad Capitalist for joining us today. Andrew, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
Today, we are going to talk about all things related to geopolitics. We're going to look at second citizenships, and there's a lot of mystery behind this topic. There's a lot of, let's just call them people in the shadows and, these unknown subjects, and they start to get a lot of people that are not exactly the most legitimate behind it. And I wanted to talk about the very first topic is, as an American, what are the options? Can people even get a second citizenship? Can they get another residence? Or are they going to be stuck with that for the rest of their lives?
Well, you're not only are you not stuck with it, but there's many options. I think people don't often understand how many citizenships you can have, and they've heard about dual citizenship. I've got three adopted sisters. They came over, they became dual citizens. Like people understood that. In most countries, if you can have dual citizenship, you can have unlimited citizenships. There's a few exceptions where if you have three or more, you have to start reporting it. But for the most part, the US, Canada, Australia, more recently, the UK, all those, you can have multiple different citizenships. When I left the US, I forget how many I had. I mean, I don't know, three or four. Now I've got five. I actually gave up the US citizenship, so I've got five and might, get more from there. So you can have multiple citizenships. Now, the requirement is that each of them would allow you to have that. So if you get citizenship by investment, where you're making a donation, you're buying property, you're doing something like that, I mean, they're kind of in the business of granting citizenship. So obviously, they're not going to force you to give up your other citizenships, or else they wouldn't have as many takers. Citizenship by descent, where you check your family tree, grandma was from Italy, great-grandfather was from Slovakia, whatever. That generally, most of those countries allow you. I mean, Lithuania is a little squirrely, as I found out myself. But most of these ways to get citizenship, you can have one, you can have two, you can have five, you can have 10. The thing that Americans don't realize is, if you're an American, you're an American. You can choose to give up your US citizenship. If you just want to save money on taxes, you can move to Puerto Rico and you can lower your taxes there. But if you're an American, you are an American. So it's not like, I mean, if you open a bank account, you have to report that bank account. If you open a foreign corporation, you have to report that corporation. And so you can't say, well, I opened that bank account as a Maltese citizen because I went to Malta and got their $1 million, give or take, citizenship. An American's an American and is an American. Even if you're not, even if your citizenship's not an issue, Americans are taxed no matter where they live. I lived all over the world. I didn't spend any time in the US, and I was able to basically exclude all of my income and defer the rest of it. That's a little harder now, but it's still largely possible. You can still reduce your taxes dramatically by living overseas, but you can never escape the US tax system. Even in Puerto Rico, you're still on the hook for all the foreign filings and all that. And so, even if you're Canadian, even if you're Australian and you live in those countries, you may have reporting requirements for doing other things. But very simply, yes, you can get multiple citizenships. That does not mean that you've given up your current citizenship. And again, for Americans, it doesn't mean you've given up those rights. But what you want to understand is the difference between residence and citizenship. A residence lets you live somewhere, generally for a certain period of time. It's not quite as secure. Citizenship is you're one of us. You have all the rights and privileges. And so I think that generally you want to either get citizenships or residences that lead to citizenship, even in some cases if you don't live there. So there's a lot of different things you want to consider. But I think every American needs a second passport. I think increasingly Canadians, Australians, others need a second passport because you never know when that first passport is going to be a hindrance.
Okay. So for a lot of people, I've talked about this topic before, and some would say, look, I'm an American. I work a 9 to 5 job. I've lived in such and such city for the last 30 years. I'm not moving. This is where my job is. This is where my family is. I'm sure you've dealt with those particular situations before. Are there options for them? What can they do at all, if anything?
Yeah. I mean, certainly one of the most common ways that people become a citizen of a country is they live there and they pay taxes and they learn the language. And then you go and you see like the naturalization ceremonies. Everybody raise your right hand and they swear everybody in together. And now you're a citizen. Congratulations. If you don't want to leave and you're saying, my goodness, I think this country is going in the wrong direction. They're going to take more of our money. There was an article about Canada recently. They said, is civil unrest coming? Those weren't my words. That was what I think the police were suggesting. Is that coming? If you're worried about whatever, let's call it black swan events taking place, or even events that are pretty predictable, like your taxes are probably going to go up. Most Western countries are broke. They're probably going to raise your taxes eventually if you have anything of consequence. Yeah, so there's programs you can get citizenship without having to move. So let's go through if you're lucky enough, probably the most affordable way to do that is citizenship by descent, through your family tree. This is the one a la carte service that we offer people because I just figure, hey, there's plenty of Americans, Canadians, Australians. They have someone in the family tree, and if they just want that backup, we will. It's the only thing we do on its own. And so you can go back, if your dad was British, for example, that's about as far back as you can go in most cases in a country like the UK, or in Canada. But you get into Europe and some of the Latin American countries, you can go to a grandparent, like in Ireland. You can go to a great grandparent, like in Italy. You can even go back further in like Slovakia. So most Caribbean and European countries and a lot of the Latin American countries let you go back at least some number of years. And you can basically say, hey, my great grandfather was Italian. And as long as in some cases you can prove that like nobody ever gave it up and it was never lost through the chain, you can go back and reclaim that. And so it may not be the fastest way to do it, but pound for pound, it's the best value because an Italian passport, for example, lets you live anywhere in the European Union as well as Switzerland and Norway and Iceland. So you've got like 30 countries that you can live in. So even if you're like, oh, my ancestors were Bulgarian, I don't want to go to Bulgaria. Right. A Bulgarian can live in Spain, can live in Switzerland, can live in Ireland. And so you've got a lot of options, kind of like states or provinces in Canada. You can move around. You've got countries, which, by the way, there are plenty of good tax deals in Europe. So if you're Bulgarian by descent, you can move to Italy or Greece or Switzerland or Ireland or Malta or Cyprus. And even though their headline tax rates may be high, you might be able to pay very, very little as a percentage because they have a special deal for new people. And so that's the easiest thing to do is check your family tree. I would also say, let's say you're born in Toronto. I'm born right across the lake in Cleveland. What if my parent was born in Toronto by happenstance? Well, by virtue of citizenship by birth on the soil, my parent would be Canadian. And we've had that with Canada and Mexico. They never even realized their parent was Canadian or Mexican, which means they can be Canadian or Mexican. So that's the first thing. Otherwise, you can make a donation. Citizenship by investment in the Caribbean has been one of the cheapest ways to do it. You don't have to go there, although there is now an interview requirement. They just did double the price, though, because the Western countries are getting upset that people have this option that for years, for $100,000, you could get a second passport and you could leave your country forever and no longer owe them anything. And under the threat of security and maybe there's a terrorist coming in, I'm pretty pro-immigration, but, Nigel Farage is speaking at our event this year. Ask him how many boats are coming to Europe. We're not checking those people, but the guy with lots of money who goes through a rigorous background check, we can't get that. So because of the threats from Europe, the price of citizenship by investment in the Caribbean doubled. It's going to cost you $200,000 and up. But those are the two main ways. The third way is more exploratory, and that is you can get what's called a paper residence, where the country requires you to live there for X number of years, but they don't define living. And so it could be you go 1 day a year, which is the requirement to keep the residence permit active. But when you apply for citizenship, they don't ask how long you've been in the country. You may have to speak the language. But in some of the Latin American countries, that's a little easier than, let's say, learning Azerbaijani or something. Those aren't guaranteed, though. So that's kind of a cheaper path for, let's say, the 9 to 5 person. But, are you lucky? Do you have $200,000? Or do you want to kind of gamble? Those are the ways without moving.
One of the aspects which we can discuss is we're talking about second citizenships, we're talking about passports. And I think for a lot of people, they don't understand the reason even why they would do so. I mean, I've tried to bring that up on my channel
Yeah.
over and over again. Um, People would say, I've talked to people saying, why don't you get your Italian citizenship? I mean, you can get it through your parents. I mean, it's pretty cheap, this and that.
Mhm.
And they would say, what? I'm not going to live there. I'm not going to go there. I'm here. I'm here. And
Yeah.
I don't think that people understand, number one, that it's relatively cheap. The fact that it could be it's a process that takes a long time too. It's not necessarily something that, okay, when I'm ready, I'm going to just snap my fingers, it's going to come to me. So you got to plan it ahead. But also the world is changing and we're moving in a place from west to east. And
Yes.
right at that kind of Middle East line. And we see the global growth going there. We see the population growing there and everything like that. And I wonder if you could talk more about this and your travels. You travel all around the world and you see and you talk to different people. If you
Yeah.
mind sharing.
Couple things come to mind. First of all, I was sitting last summer in Tuscany with a very successful gentleman who said, when I bought this villa, big, beautiful, I mean, spread that he has, and he said, I didn't realize as an American, I couldn't just come to Italy and stay as long as I wanted. He's a very successful, educated guy. And I think a lot of Americans in particular don't realize that. They just think I don't need a visa to go anywhere. I could just go and live as long as I want. It's like, no, you get 90 out of 180 days. Now you can get a residence permit, or you can just go and get a citizenship. Let's say Malta. That's the more expensive version by investment. It's going to cost about $1 million for your family. But now you can live anywhere in Europe. And so, yeah, if you have Italian ancestry and you can claim that passport, we're going to be a little bit more on the expensive side, but you're going to pay us 1 or 2%, maybe 3% if you got a big family of what you'd pay for Malta. Same passport, same ability to live anywhere in Europe. Yeah, I'll take the 98% cheaper option. And so I think that people don't realize what they need to travel somewhere else. And they say, "Oh, I'm happy here." Well, uh, if you live in North America, you have ancestors more than likely that came from somewhere. And I think kind of putting yourself in their shoes and realizing at some point they had to make a decision. They wanted better opportunities. They wanted more freedom. They felt oppressed. And so they said, I'm gonna leave and go to this place. What did I say? Go where you're treated best. Those are my 5 magic words. They went where they were treated best, or where they imagined they would be treated best. And there's going to come a time. I mean, people who say, oh, I'm here in the US, I'll leave when things get bad enough. Look at the last 25 years. If you were being objective, don't you think there's been, I mean, the government spying on you? Like, I mean, all this stuff has happened in the last 25 years. Really? Like, you think at no point would an objective person have said, okay, fine, now things are bad enough. I'll leave when things are bad enough is basically, I'm going to keep being the frog in the boiling pot and just saying, oh, this is a good temperature. This is comfortable. Um, I just think, and we were talking before, are most of the clients Americans? At this point, we're pretty well distributed. I think we're like 22% or something in the last quarter were Americans. And we love the Americans and they're great clients. But we got folks from all over the world who realize things are going in the wrong direction. And what I learn, we have our annual event in Malaysia. I've lived in Malaysia part-time for 11 years. Um, Kuala Lumpur is a nicer city than some in the United States, at least the places you would go, right? And you don't go to the bad parts of your city already. So like, oh, I hear the bad part of Kuala Lumpur is a real dump. It's like, yeah, the bad part of Chicago is a dump too. Um, and so I can tell you, what's Malaysia doing? They want to join BRICS. And what's their argument? It's very Trumpian. We're tired of being told by the US to benefit only them. Hey, just be on our side. Trust us. Same thing Africa's saying. You guys come and you give us a lecture. China comes, gives us a hospital. Guess we're putting it's Malaysia first. It's Rwanda first. It's everything that people, and I don't agree with either side in the US. I'm politically homeless, but if you are pro-America first, then you should be pro those countries being themselves first. And the deal that they're getting from the Western world is not good. So they're going to go where they're treated best as well. And so I think the quality of living is better there. The optimism is better there. Wages are going up. I hire people. We've got almost 100 people working here from all around the world. It is a lot more expensive than it was everywhere, but certainly in the emerging world. than it was, 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's a lot more expensive now because there's just so many more opportunities out there. And they have something to look forward to as opposed to in the West where they're just looking for like everything's kind of falling apart and you can't just be American and be on easy street anymore. You actually have to like do something and that's kind of bothering people and there's civil unrest. So, I mean, all that to say, I wouldn't, if I'm American, just get my Italian passport. I would make that part of a portfolio. I'm just talking, we have what's called the chief knowledge officer here, and they handle all of our R&D, everything we do about knowledge. I think we know more than any other company out there about this stuff. And we're talking about African passports. That may not be your first, second passport. There are a few that have opened up if you're African American or African Canadian, like they're opening up. But I think people should consider some of those. Buy a house in Egypt, get citizenship, sell it in 5 years. You've got that passport for life, and you've got an insurance policy that's non-Western now. Because I agree with you, Asia is a very hard place to get citizenship, but with BRICS and multipolarity, I want some options that are different. And I'll give you this last point. If I'm a U.S. citizen and I run businesses, not only am I subject, even if I don't live in the U.S., to all kinds of U.S. regulations because they feel like they own me, which should tell you something. But look at the trade wars they're talking about. Look at, oh, TikTok, we're going to take it over. I'd like to do business a lot of places. And what happens when you see more places like China that are to say, oh, we don't want Americans coming here now? The Americans are like, yeah, well, we're still the best, beat our chest. Like, okay, good, we don't need you. Okay, well, where's all the growth in the world? It's not in the West. So if you want to sell your stuff, I just mentioned we went from, I think, probably an all-time high of 70% or 60% American clients down to 22%. I don't have fewer Americans. I just have more of everybody else. And to me, that's the way to grow a business. By the way, if there's a recession in the US, there won't be a recession probably everywhere. So I'll be more resistant. That would be harder to do as an American than as a St. Lucian, where people as a St. Lucian will be, okay, come on in. American, hey, we're sick of you guys pushing us around. So those are all the reasons why you want to be prepared.
There's a lot of, perhaps it was in your book, but companies that simply don't want to deal with the financial regulators of the United States. And they're just saying, whether it's crypto companies or whatever, there's just saying, we're not gonna deal with you. We'd rather not even have your business because it's just too difficult, the regulations. And certainly Canada's basically the same thing in a different way.
I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of bad actors in crypto. And, my father's the most honest guy I know. He raised me to do the right thing. And he said, he's very strict. Like, you got to do the right thing. You got to treat people right. But my goodness, every time I go on the crypto news sites, it's like everybody and their dog is being sued by the SEC. Like, really? These guys are all terrible people? Like, really? It's like, no, it's going against their power and they don't like it. And that's one reason why I wouldn't be in the country and I wouldn't be a citizen, quite frankly. If I'm in a new technology like that, I mean, I just had an interview that I did recently with one of the first guys, like back in the 90s, to renounce US citizenship. He was into cryptography and it was illegal back then in the US. So he went where he was treated best and he went to Anguilla, this little island in the Caribbean. And so, yeah, there are banks around the world that just don't want Americans. Now, this idea that there's nowhere for an American to get a bank account, that's nonsense. We help Americans get bank accounts all the time. They often aren't as functional. Like, you can't make investments in a private bank in Singapore, for example, because they don't comply with SEC regulations. So they can't, you just keep your cash there, but you can get a bank account. But yeah, the US has put so many regulations with what's called FATCA. Now the world has kind of copied that with their own information sharing regime. But I'll tell you, it was very telling. I went to a dinner for a bank that I have an account with. And they did a road show and they came through Kuala Lumpur when I was there. And I asked the banker, I said, confirm a suspicion I have. You'd rather have a wealthy Indonesian than a wealthy American all day long. She said, not even a competition. And here are the Americans being like, everyone wants American money. I mean, they literally say that, not our clients, but like you hear people like, people always take American money. It's like, no, they won't. Like, we have to listen, it feels nice to be wanted, no doubt about it. I like to live in reality. The reality is most places do not care. There are more, I mean, we've had Indonesian, Vietnamese, Egyptian, Brazilian clients, all centimillionaires. Wouldn't you rather take their $100 million with very few regulations and be able to sell them more services and make more money than take an American where if you fill out one form wrong, your whole bank gets thrown into limbo. I mean, why would you want to put up with that? And by the way, Americans, I mean, you can go to Georgia and open an account as an American, but that's your option for a cheap bank account. If you want to go to Singapore, it's 6 figures. If you want to go to Switzerland, it's 7 figures because that's the price they need to charge you, for deposits, for them to bother with making sure they have enough people to do the paperwork right, so the U.S. doesn't ace them out of the entire dollar system. And so it is getting harder. Crypto, we've seen the same thing. People got second passports and suddenly they were able to invest. There are mutual funds. There are various funds. I've got a guy who runs a property fund in Cambodia that I invest in. He can't have more than 50% Americans. Other funds don't take Americans at all. I've had Americans calling saying, I can't get into this crypto deal. They won't take U.S. residents, or they won't take people who only have a U.S. passport or who live in the U.S. You've got to have an overseas address. It's so much risk. And again, I say to myself, yeah, why do you want to deal with Americans with that threat of dealing with the US government if there's so many people out there who are wealthy? And you don't see this living in the US or Canada, but I see it traveling. I see it working with them. I see it hearing from them. We go to events around the world. There are more and more wealthy people in the countries that you snub your nose at than you would imagine. And I think that's the future.